네, 그럼 지금부터 2부를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 2부 사회를 맡은 박유환입니다. 이번 2부에서는 아시아 각국의 사회언어학 연구 동향이란 주제로 일본, 중국, 싱가포르, 필리핀의 저명한 사회언어학자 4분을 모시고 특강을 듣는 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 아쉽게도 이분들을 직접 모시지는 못했습니다. 하지만 오늘은 이미 공지해드린 대로 이분들께서 작성해서 보내주신 발표 동영상과 함께 저희가 준비한 번역 화면을 같이 여러분께 송출해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 발표 내용 번역 작업에 3분의 우리 회원 선생님들께서 많은 고생을 해주셨는데요. 오늘은 발표자 소개와 함께 진행까지 같이 더 수고해 주시겠습니다. 여러분께서 발표를 들으시다가 질문 사항이 있으시면 줌이나 유튜브에서 채팅창을 통해서 질문을 올려주시면 나중에 4부에 좌장 선생님께서 대신해서 질문을 발표자께 해주실 것이고, 혹시 시간 관계상 그 시간에 진행을 못하는 그런 질문 및 대답에 대해서는 저희가 다 일일이 체크해서 발표자분께 이메일 통해서 질문을 드리고 답변을 받아서 다음 주 중에 학회 홈페이지에 올려드리도록 하겠습니다. 많은 참여 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 그럼 지금부터 2부 첫 번째 발표 진행하도록 하겠습니다.
네, 첫 번째 특강은 일본 사회언어과학회 전 회장이셨고 현재 일본 니혼대학 물리학부 명예교수이신 오기노 츠나오 교수님께서 일본 사회언어학 연구의 유래라는 주제로 발표해 주시겠습니다.
はい、それでは日本の社会言語学の流れについて、40分ほど、お話をさせていただきます。私は日本大学の荻野綱夫と申します。よろしくお願いします。さて、今日のお話は、だいたい4つぐらいにこの順でお話ししようかと考えております。まず最初に社会言語学の研究史を眺めてというわけで、日本の社会言語学の発端から、数十年の間ですね、を見ようかと思います。で、2番目に社会言語科学会という、学会が日本にあるんですけれども、この学会がどうやってできてきたのか、その社会言語学に関する学会なんですが、その様子を若干お話ししようかと考えております。3番目には、この社会言語科学会は、創立後約20年経ってるんですけれども、この20年の間にどういうふうに変わってきたのか、こういう観点から見ていきたいというふうに思います。そして4番目には、これ最後になりますけれども、日本の社会言語学がこれからどうなっていくのか、そのあたりの、未来予測といいますかね、展望について、いくつか思い当たるところをお話しさせていただきます。こんな感じで、進めていきたいということです。さて、まず、丸括弧の1なんですが、社会言語学の研究史を眺めてみると、どんな風に見えるかということですね。で、その社会言語学と言われるものは、比較的最近そういう名前が使われるようになったと思っております。で、日本では、それよりもずっと早く、言語生活研究というものが行われてきました。で、日本の社会言語学の研究史を眺めるとなると、まずは日本の言語生活研究を見ることが最初に必要になろうかと思います。で、本格的な研究ということで考えてみますと、最初に取り上げるべきは日本人の読み書き能力調査というものなんですね。 これは1万人以上の人を対象にした、本格的な大量調査と言えると思いますが、今から考えてみれば、これは社会言語学的な研究の発端であったというふうに見なして差し支えないと思います。で、この読み書き能力調査というのは、第二次世界大戦終了後に、日本がアメリカというよりは、本来は GHQ というべきですが、その進駐軍といいますかね、の元にあったときに行われた調査です。そして、この調査に携わった人の多くが、後に国立国語研究所に入所しました。例えば、野本菊夫さん、柴田武さん、北村はじめさんなど、さん付けで読むのはちょっと失礼かもしれないんですが、それぞれ大先生たちなんですけれども、そういう人たちが国立国語研究所に入所したわけなんですね。で、その後は国立国語研究所で、同様の研究を行うことになるんですけれども、そういうことから考えても、この日本人の読み書き能力調査というのは、この社会言語学の最初の発端と位置づけられる研究だというふうに言っていいと思います。で、次に、国立国語研究所の創設ということで、1948年に、作られまして、で、その中でですね、言語生活調査というのが行われたわけであります。で、この国立国語研究所ということで、ここでいう国語というのはもちろん日本語のことなんですけれども、ですから、国語の研究をするには、国語学という学問分野がありますから、そういうところの研究者を集めてきて、この研究所を作るというのが、普通にはですね、当然のことだろうと思われます。ところがですね、実際に見てみますと、当時の国語学の関係者は、国立国語研究所には、あまり招かれてないのですね。で、大部分は言語学の出身者だったわけです。先ほど名前を出した野本、柴田、北村などというような研究者は、それぞれ言語学の出身でした。で、当時の日本の学問領域では、国語学というのと言語学というのはかなり違ったものを研究していたわけなんですね。で、国語学と言いますと、普通には古典語の研究、古文の研究、時代で言えば江戸時代以前の日本語ですね、の研究をしていたわけです。そして言語学というと、世界のいろいろな言語の研究ということになりますが、それと同時にですね、日本ではそういうのは、現代語研究という括りにも当てはまると思います。言語学を研究している人の一部は、日本語についても研究するようになったわけですが、その時の日本語というのは、現代語のことだったんですね。で、そこで国語学というのと言語学というのは、実は、住み分けが、あったわけであります。で、そうしますと、国立国語研究所が、設立されて、で、そこで、今の、ね、現在の、今から言えば当時のになりますが、その時の、日本語の状況、および、日本人の言語生活がどうなっているのか、つまり、その時の、その状況について研究したいということですから、これは現代語研究 という、そういう流れになるわけですね。で、そうしますと、国語学の関係者を招いて研究してもらおうというとですね、そういう人たちの専門分野は古典語ですから、現代語については、もちろんできないわけじゃないんでしょうけれども、自分たちの専門と大きく異なるという意識があったのではないかと思われます。一方、言語学の関係者は、世界のいろいろな言語の研究をしますから、仮に日本語であってもですね、それは現代使われている言葉であれば、それは研究対象であるというようなことから、国立国語研究所で行う新しい研究、現代語の研究ですね、というようなことを考えると、言語学の人は特に違和感はあまりなかったのではないかと思われます。そんなわけで、国立国語研究所が作られて、言語生活研究が始まるんですけれども、それに関わる人の多くは言語学の出身ということになったわけなんですね。で、これは国語研究所のその研究の方向性をある程度左右したと考えられるわけです。それともう一つ、このスライドにも書きましたけれども、国立国語研究所が作られて、数年間ですね、その初期段階ですけれども、その頃、統計数理研究所との共同研究が極めて盛んに行われました。で、この結果ですね、国語研究所の、研究員たちは、統計学などにも詳しくなりまして、当時の統計数理研究所というと、例えば林千夫さんなどという、これは数量化理論の創始者になるんですが、そういう人たちと一緒に研究することで、そのような統計学を用いた研究というのが国語研究所の中にも芽生えてくるわけですね。それとともに統計学の方でも日本語を扱って研究しようというちょっとした傾向が現れるんですけれども、そのことはここでは触れないでおきましょう。さて、そうやって行われた国立国語研究所の言語生活調査なんですけれども、たくさんの報告書が出版、刊行されていますね。で、そういう調査を、現代の目で、どう見るべきかということについてちょっとお話ししておこうかと思います。で、そうしますと、これはですね、当時の研究の流れから考えると、極めて斬新な研究になります。つまり、それまで、このような言語生活という見方もされてこなかったし、あまり調査研究の対象とならなかったわけですね。で、そういう状況で国立国語研究所がいわば新たにこういう分野を、作ったような感じになるわけです。で、そうしますと、そこに集まってきた研究者たちはですね、この言語生活調査を行うことになって、ちょっと困ったことになったんですね。つまり、先行研究がないのです。全くないというとちょっと語弊があるかもしれませんけれども、少なくとも大規模調査などというようなことは、戦争前にはほとんどなされたことはありません。ですから、そういう調査をしてですね、日本人の言語生活を、記述しようなどと言っても、身の回りに頼りになるものは全然ないですね。ということで、では、研究者たちはどうしたらいいか。自分たちで議論してどういう研究をすればいいのか、そういう方法論から、考えたわけなんですね。ということで、この頃の言語生活研究の報告書を読むと、極めて刺激的な感じがします。 例えば、敬語と敬語意識というね、報告書がありますけれども、これなんかはですね、最初に出たのは1950年代になっちゃいますけれども、その報告書、大変面白いですね。いろいろなタイプの調査が行われてますけれども、で、みんなで考えてこういうふうにすればわかるんじゃないかということで、研究してるわけですね。で、その後、似たような調査が何回か行われましたけれども、それはもうすでにその先行研究があって、それが今どうなってるかという、その時間的な流れで、ね、変化を見ようなどという研究ですから、いわばもうお手本が前にあったわけですね。ですから、報告書といっても、ちょっと面白さに欠ける面があるような気がします。すでに分かっていることを確認するような調査になりがちだからなんですね。一方、最初の調査というのは、そういうお手本が何もありませんので、いわば手探り状態、試行錯誤の連続です。そういう中で行われた研究ですから、このあたりの報告書というのは、とても面白いものが多いと思います。例えば、そうですね、地域社会の言語生活とかですね、そういうのも、何冊か時代を隔てて、何回か調査を行うから、そのたんびに報告書出ますけれども、最初の報告書が一番面白いんじゃないですか。ね。というわけで、やはり、この国語研究所が作られて、言語生活調査が始まった時点で、社会言語学がいわば始まったようなもんなんですけれども、その時の報告書の類を読むとですね、今でも非常に参考になる面が多々あるように思います。さて、そうやって国立国語研究所で、非常に優れた業績がたくさん、生まれたわけなんですけれども、そういう仕事をしてきた所員の多くは大学の教員になったわけなんですね。で、国立国語研究所から、日本各地の大学に、出ていったといいますかね、そういうことになって、で、その大学で社会言語学を教えたりして広めたわけであります。例えば、野本喜久夫さんとかですね、徳川宗正さんとか、真田真治さんなどというのは、そういうふうに、国立国語研究所で、言語生活研究をしていた人たちですけれども、後に各大学で社会言語学を教えるようになったわけですね。で、そうやって、社会言語学が国立国語研究所を発端にして、日本の各大学に広がりつつあった、そういう流れができたということになるわけです。で、その頃というのは、1970年前後でしょうかね。いろいろな研究者が大学で教えるようになって、日本中でそういう社会言語学のような研究が盛んになり始めた頃なんですけれども、その頃の社会言語学の研究者というのは方言の研究者と重なっていたわけなんですね。で、それは学問領域として近いということもありますけれども、社会言語学の研究テーマというのが地域社会、方言が使われている地域社会で、いろいろ調査して、その研究を進めていくというタイプのものが多かったのです。そんなこともあって、この社会言語学と方言研究というのは非常に近い関係にありました。言語地理学という分野がありますけれども、これは、社会言語学的な面もあるし、一方では方言学の一部とも言えるわけですね。ですから、例えば社会言語学などは、この言語地理学はですね、社会言語学と方言学の橋渡しをしたというふうに、言ってもいいんじゃないでしょうか。そして、方言研究が盛んになると、社会言語学はちょっと衰退といいますかね、研究が少し下火になるような傾向があったりしました。 方言研究といいますと、ちょうどこの頃、日本言語地図のプロジェクトが国語研究所で行われたわけですね。で、日本中の研究者がいわば動員されるような形になって、日本言語地図が作られたんですけれども、そういうのが盛んになると、言語生活研究といいますか、社会言語学っていうのは、ちょっと下火になっちゃったんですね。で、その後、方言学が、その日本言語地図完成とともにですね、方言学が少し、下火とは言いませんけれども、落ち着いてくると、今度は社会言語学が盛んになっていく。こういう学問領域の関係がそこにあるということが見えるわけなんですね。で、そういうわけで、日本の社会言語学に対しては、国立国語研究所というのは、直接、間接に様々な影響を与えてきました。で、特に、柴田武史、さん付けするのを恐縮ですが、私の恩師になるんですけれども、東京大学に、着任しまして、そこで、その、東大時代に育てた研究者がいろいろいます。名前を挙げれば、井上文雄さんとか、沢木元栄さんなどがいますね。で、実は私もちょうど柴田先生に指示した形ですので、含めてもいいかもしれませんけれども、こんな風にして、やはり日本の社会言語学の研究史を眺めると、国語研究所が発端で、そこからどんどんなんていうんですか、広がっていった、日本中にね、広がっていった。そういう歴史が、社会言語学の、前半といいますかね、の流れと言えるかと思います。さて、このような日本における社会言語学の研究史に直接は関わらないのですけれども、もう一つの流れとして、アメリカの社会言語学の影響があるんです。で、これもちょうど1970年代ぐらいに、アメリカのSociolinguisticsというのが盛んになりまして、その影響が日本に及ぶんですね。例えば、ウィリアム・ラボフという人が1972年に Sociolinguistic Patterns という本を出しています。これはもう社会言語学のバイブルみたいな本ですけれども。で、例えば、こういうそのアメリカの研究に接して、社会言語学に触れた人というのがいますね。で、後に日本に帰ってきて、で、日本の大学で、主として英文学科なんですが、そういうところの教員になった人というのがいろいろいます。名前をそこに挙げましたけれども、例えば井出幸子さん、日比谷純子さん、松田健次郎さん、橋内武さんなどなど、社会言語学のという方面で名前が知られていると思いますけれども、どちらかといえばアメリカ留学組と言っていいんじゃないでしょうか。で、その時にはアメリカではハイムズとかラボフ、サンコフなどに支持したということになるわけですね。で、そういう、なんていうんですか、日本の中の流れとちょっと違う流れがもう一方のアメリカの影響という形であったわけです。そして、このように、日本で起こった言語生活研究から、社会言語学という流れと、アメリカで学んできて、そういう方法論などを心得て、日本で研究を始めた人たちというのが、いわば別の流れとして存在していたのですけれども、1987年6月に日本言語学会第94回大会で社会言語学シンポジウム副題として社会言語学の理論と方法という、こういうシンポジウムが開かれたことがあるんですね。で、この時に、この、シンポジウムの内容については、言語研究という雑誌の第93号に概要が掲載されていますけれども、このシンポジウムは、日本派とアメリカ派、あんまり簡単に言うとちょっとまずいんですが、 そういう2つの流れが、いわばこの、なんていうんですか、作られた喧嘩をしてですね、いや、ああだこうだとこう、それぞれの立場でこう話をする。で、違いと共通点を、明らかにする。こういう感じで行われたのがこのシンポジウムなんですね。ですから、このシンポジウムで、それまではその日本派と欧米派がちょっとこう違う立場で、あまりこう研究の交流がなくてですね、それぞれに研究が進められていたのが、いわばこう重なってきたという、そういう意味ではちょっとエポックメイキング的なシンポジウムだったと言ってもいいんじゃないでしょうか。さて、ここで、このシンポジウムの後に関わる話として、社会言語科学会というものを持ち出したいと思います。で、詳しいことはここにURL を書いておきましたので、これで見てもらうことができると思いますけれども、この日本で社会言語科学会を作ったといいますか、これが発足したのが1998年の1月ですね。ですから先ほどの社会言語学シンポジウムから10年以上経ってこの学会という形になってきたわけです。でこの社会言語科学会、2018年の段階で創立20周年ということで、ちょっとそういう行事もあったんですけれども、ざっと約20年ちょい、動いている学会であるということになります。で、この学会が発足することで、ちょっと影響を受けた社会言語学関連のグループがありました。一つは1994年に発足した、社会言語学研究会というのがあって、独自の活動をしてきたんですが、これは発展的に解消されました。また、1987年に発足した社会言語学ワークショップ。でこれは日本言語学会のシンポジウムがきっかけになって、こういうワークショップがですね、日本言語学会の研究大会に付随して開催されてきたんですね。これも1997年6月が最後になって、いわばそういう小さな研究会とかがまとまってですね、この社会言語科学会という大きな学会ができた、そういう感じになろうかと思います。で、最近の例ですと、2020年3月に大会があるはずだったんですけれども、新型コロナウイルス感染症が広がったがために、これ中止になってしまったんですけれども、こういう学会が発足した。で、この学会が発足した後、また少し研究の流れというのが変わってきたように思うんですね。まず、この社会言語科学会の特徴として、学際性ということが挙げられるわけです。学際性、つまり、いろいろな学問領域の境界線上にある。そういう特徴があります。なぜそうしなければならなかったかというあたりは、なかなか微妙な問題を含むんですけれども、これは私の解釈、考え方としてですね、ここにいくつか挙げておきました。まず、徳川さんが初代会長になったんですけれども、徳川さん自身が学際性ということを、強く打ち出して、いろいろな分野の人を巻き込みながら、やっていこうということを打ち出しました。この徳川さんの信念が大きく影響をしたかと思います。そして、この社会言語科学会が生まれるときには、学会誌の刊行が強く要望されていたわけですね。で、これはいくつか小さな研究会が、みんなで集まって議論するというのは行われていたんですけれども、雑誌の刊行までは行きませんでした。で、そこでぜひ雑誌を出したいということになりまして、で、そのために、学会を作ろうという機運が高まったわけなんですね。で、しかし雑誌を出すためにはそれなりの会員数が必要になるのですけれども、これでですね、例えば日本流の社会言語学をやってる人が、かなりの数いたといえばいたんですけれども、やはりそれだけでは十分な会員数にはならないということに、見込みとしてですね、なってきたわけなんですね。 これは学会をずっと運営していく上では、なかなか難しい問題がそこに出てきてしまいます。そして、いざ学際性を打ち出して、そういう学会が発足してみたら、性格としては学際学会ということになりますけれども、これはこれで特徴があり、面白い学会であるということが、分かって、広く受け入れられるようになったんですね。そういういくつかの、理由といいますか、があって、学際的な学会が成立したということになろうかと思います。そして、この社会言語科学会が発足した後は、会員数も順調に増大しましたし、社会言語学の研究の中心的存在になっていったわけです。もちろん、他の学会でそういう社会言語学の研究発表がなされることありますけれども、だんだんこの社会言語科学会で発表する方がいいというような考え方が一般になってきました。これは社会言語科学会の発起人のリストになります。名前がわかる人もたくさんいるかと思いますけれども、こういう発起人を見るとですね、発起人よりもこの専門分野の方がもしかしたらいいでしょうかね。見てみると、いわゆる社会言語学の人ではなくて、もうちょっと幅広い分野の人がここに集まっているということがわかるわけですね。さらに、こちらは社会言語科学会の歴代会長、初代の徳川さんから始まって、ずっと、今、片岡さんがやってますけれども、を挙げました。で、そうすると、いわゆる、徳川さんだったら社会言語学の人とも言えるかもしれませんが、大坊さんなどというのは、社会心理学の人ですし、岡さんは心理学ですよね。あるいは大越さんというと、朝鮮語学と言いますかね、言語学って言いますかね、そういう人になりますし、橋本さんですと、コミュニケーション論ですよね。というふうに、歴代会長も様々なバックグラウンドの人が順次務めるということになってきて、この社会言語科学会が学際的な学会であることを象徴しているように思います。で、これはですね、過去20年で社会言語科学会がどうなってきたかということを会員数の面から見たものです。で、そうしますと、これは発足の最初ですね。一般会員が346人、学生会員151人、これぐらいの規模で発足した学会ですね。で、これは翌年ですけれども、もうかなりの数になって700人を超える人が集まっているということになります。で、最初の年はなんていうんですかね、やっぱり数は小さめですけれども、すぐある程度の数になって、で、これからどんどん増えてきます。そして、2019年の4月23日、もう1000人以上の学会の会員数を、持つようになりました。というわけで、社会言語科学会はどんどん大きくなっていると言っていいと思います。同様に、学会誌のページ数を見ても、厚くなっていることは明らかです。最初の1巻1号が刊行されたのは1998年11月ですけれども、72ページでした。で、第2号も60ページで、この頃は学会誌が薄かったわけですね。徳川さんが随分薄いねと言ってたことを今でも覚えてますけれども。で、最近の例として、ボリューム22ナンバー1ですね。2019年9月のものですけれども、301ページですね。そして、ナンバー2は114ページ。ですから、この20年ほどの間に、極めて厚くなってきたということは明らかです。それから、こちらは、大会での発表件数の変遷なんですけれども、第1回、第2回、最初の年ですね、10件、16件、こういう件数だったですね。第3回、22件、第4回、15件、いずれにしてもこんなような数で行っていたということになります。ところが、43 3回、2019年ですけれども、44件。こんな風に発表件数増えてきたわけですね。44回はもっと増えたんですが、これは実際には大会が中止になっちゃいましたからね、発表件数、予行詞はこうだっていうことは分かりますけれども、ちょっと割り引いて考えなければいけないかもしれません。とにかくこうやってですね、この20年の間に、社会言語科学会はどんどん盛んになってきたということは言えるんじゃないでしょうか。それから、この学会誌社会言語科学と大会発表の傾向をちょっと見てみました。でこれはそれぞれの創立当初といいますかの2年間とですね、最近の2年間をどういう論文が書かれたか、どういう発表があったかということで、そこで用いられたデータですね、を基準にして分類してみました。で、何件がそれに該当するかということを表にしたわけです。で、それでですね、それぞれ、この分類は、私がえいやっと分類したんですけれども、こういうデータを使ってるよぐらいで、見てもらえばいいかと思います。で、ここでいう大会発表っていうのは、シンポジウムとか招待講演、あるいはワークショップっていうのは、除いて、カウントしております。それから、1件で2種類のデータを使うということがあると、それぞれカウントしてますので、論文の本数、あるいは大会発表の件数よりは、もうちょっと、多く、カウントされております。で、こうすると、傾向は明らかですね。ここが多いのですね。つまり、コーパスなんです。ですから、この20年間で、論文もたくさん書かれるようになり、研究発表もたくさんされるようになりましたけれども、その中で特に増えているのが、このコーパスを使った研究と言っていいと思います。さて、このような社会言語科学会の過去20年を見てきますと、これから社会言語学、日本の社会言語学がどうなるかということがある程度予測できるように思います。まず、社会言語科学会が今後どうなるかというところなんですけれども、今まで順調に伸びてきた社会言語科学会ですけれども、そろそろ会員数が頭打ち傾向になってきているように思います。これは最近、新入会員もありますけれども、退会する人もいて、あまり会員数増えてないですね。ちょっと減り気味かもしれません。そして、その学際分野というのは、創立当初から、その社会言語科学会が学際的であるという性格がずっと続きましたが、学際分野であるということはですね、どうしても第二学会的な性格を持つ傾向があるんですね。第二学会というのは、それぞれの会員はですね、自分のメインとする第一学会を持っていて、そちらが主だと考えている。で、ついでに第二学会にも入る。そういう傾向があるんですね。となると、この社会言語科学会を中心にして研究していく研究者というのはあまり多くないということにもなるかと思います。そして日本社会は全体として少子高齢化の傾向がありますね。ということで、これが学会にも影響していて、若い会員の伸びが鈍化するということがありそうです。そういうわけで、多くの人が結集し続ける場であるかということについては、ちょっと不透明なんですけれども、今までそういうふうにやってきたので、これからも一応こういう場であろうと考えております。しかし、今までよりは少し性格がまた変わって、この頭打ち的なことになるかもしれません。で、この学際学会が日本の学会の中で成り立っていけるかという問題があるんですね。これはちょっと今回のお話からテーマが外れてきてしまいますので、あまり詳しくお話しすることできないんですけれども、学会のあり方としてですね、例えばいろいろな大学になんとか学科というのがありますよね。 で、そういうのと同様にですね、じゃあ、その学生分野としての社会言語学の学科などがあるのかということになると、これがなかなか難しいわけですね。で、やはり従来の学科の枠っていうのが、大学の中では確立してますから、例えば国文学科とか英文学科などというのは、もうそこら中の大学にあるわけですよね。だけど、社会言語学科などというのは、まだ聞いたことないですね。ということで、この大学の中でどうだということから言うと、まあ若干、まだ学際学会だからこそ、まあ第一学会、主学会という性格はなかなか持てないという面があるんですね。で、まあこれはだからちょっと、なんてネガティブな、側面なんですが、もう一方はですね、日本語教育分野との関連が最近強まってますね。これはまあ、学際学会ということでくくってもいいかもしれません。日本語教育もかなり学際的な性格が強いんですが、まあ、社会言語学もそうなので、まあ、両方の分野にそれぞれ学会参加している同じ人がね、両方に参加するような、そういう傾向が見られます。で、日本語教育っていうのは非常に関係者が多いですね。ですから、そういう盛んな分野と連携することで、社会言語学もですね、少し日本語教育に偏るような動きがあるかもしれません。そして、研究方法。これも今後変わっていくように思います。先ほど学会誌及び大会発表での傾向を見ましたけれども、質問調査からコーパスへという、データといいますかね、研究方法の変化が認められます。これほどはっきりはしませんけれども、コンピューターの使い方もですね、ちょっと変わりつつあるようで、だんだん統計的な処理が盛んになってきております。というわけで、今後の日本の社会言語学を見ていくならば、この2つの傾向が見られるかなというのが、私の主観的な展望ということになります。
And now I'd like to introduce the next presentation given by Professor Gao Yihong. Professor Gao is a professor of linguistics and director of Institute of Linguistics and Applied Linguistics at School of Foreign Languages from Peking University. She was a chairperson of the Association of Chinese Sociolinguistics from 2008 to 2010. Her presentation topic today is 40 years of sociolinguistic research in China, an overview.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gao Yihong from Peking University in China. I feel greatly honored to be invited here by Professor Pike and other conference organizers to share with you my overview of sociolinguistics in China in the past 40 years. It's a very hard task to talk about 40 years in 30 minutes. I'll try my best. And now I will try to share my PPT. Okay, how come I don't see myself? Okay, so here. Okay, so my topic is 40 years of sociolinguistic research in China, an overview. And the scope of the overview is like this. So I'll focus on research in the People's Republic of China from 1980 to this year. And the focus will be particularly put on studies published in Chinese because these are less known to the international community. So I'll talk about major research outcomes, institutionalization, characteristics, and perceived prospects. Okay, the beginning, right? So sociolinguistics is, well, beginning is connected to China's historical traditions. For example, the study of minority languages and study of dialects in a descriptive sense, but not necessarily connected to social factors. Right? It's also situated in the context of China's modernization and globalization, rapid social change, and vast community differences. Right? So marking the beginning of China's sociolinguistics is a little book called Language and Social Life, written by Chen Yuan. Right? It's quite informal in style, right? And it's really a critical reflection on the relation between linguistic phenomena and socio-political influence. For example, linguistic fetishism during China's Cultural Revolution. It's a very interesting and thought-provoking work, right? Not necessarily very systematic as an academic monograph or textbook. But later on, in 2 years' time, Chen Yuan published another book, Sociolinguistics, which is more systematic. And at that time, there were also a lot of translations of classical sociolinguistic works, right? Importation from the West. For example, Professor Zhu Wanjin's Chinese translation included works of Bernstein, of Labov, Trudgill, Fishman, and Lambert, and so on. Right? And also, there emerged many introductory works and textbooks. Right? And universities like mine, Peking University, started to offer courses in sociolinguistics. And this happened both in the Chinese language, in the Chinese department, and also in the English language, in the English department. Now, from the beginning, there was a call for grounding sociolinguistic research in the Chinese context, highlighting distinct characteristics of Chinese cultural tradition and histories. So sociolinguistics in China was positioned as an applied discipline, which seemed to differ from both Western sociolinguistics and Soviet Union sociolinguistics, right? And at the same time, there were publications, not many, there were international publications on some phenomena, descriptive and also theoretical consideration of phenomena in Chinese. For example, politeness. Now, that was the first 20 years. And after the the beginning of the new millennium, there was fast development in sociolinguistics. And I will introduce several major areas. Now, language situation. China has 56 ethnic groups, and there are also numerous dialects in the Chinese language. Right? So, with the very rapid economic growth, these linguistic varieties are diminishing and some are dying. Right? So, with this as the background, there have been many descriptive studies on endangered Chinese minority languages and also Chinese dialects. There was also theoretical effort in bridging Chinese dialectology and sociolinguistics. Right? This is You Rujie, his collaborative work called Dialects and Chinese Culture. Right? Because time is so short and the diminishing, the disappearing of linguistic varieties so fast, and there is no time, not enough resources to rescue or to protect these linguistic varieties. So some scholars proposed that we should distinguish between language preservation and language protection. As we can't do that much in language protection, it's not that realistic. What we should really focus on is language preservation. That is to record the linguistic varieties before they actually disappear. Right? So Cao Zhiyun and his colleagues pioneered some large-scale projects for language preservation. For example, Linguistic Atlas of Chinese Dialects. These are the Linguistic Atlas. And also the Chinese Language Audio Database Resources and Multimodal Encyclopedia of Chinese Cultures of Linguistic Varieties. These are very precious recordings, right, of these disappearing linguistic varieties. Right. Another big thing is language life. This is a Chinese term, language life, but actually refers to language situation in terms of how language is used in particular domain. Right? And related to this is an annual publication called Green Paper on Language Situation in China. Right? And this is annually released by the State Language Commission since 2006. So it's already about 15 years. Right? And the Green Paper is a collection of portrayals and descriptive statistics of language use in various domains. Right? And this is to serve primarily as a basis for top-down language planning, but also for research and social use. Now, related to language situation is language policy and language planning. Right? And in China, there is a great need for national unity, particularly with so many ethnic groups, right? And also mutual communication in a multilingual society. How do we communicate? Right? So there is a pretty strong top-down language policy and language planning tradition. Right? And the LPLP, language policy and language planning, is a very big field in China, right, with great institutional support, like funding, institutions, and so on. Right? As a language planner, a government official, and also initiator of the Green Paper project, Li Yuming proposes function planning alongside the conventional status planning and corpus planning. So there are multiple functions, 8 social functions, and there are 5 types of spoken and written languages. And these should be distributed according to these different social functions, according to Li Yuming. So we can see that in China, in addition to the green paper, there is also the white paper, the blue paper, and the yellow paper. Right? So they have different characteristics, and these all show efforts of language planning. Right? Language variation and urban language studies. Now, this branch of study has the background of large-scale industrial and agricultural immigration in the Mao Zedong decades, right? And also contemporary urbanization and immigration, that is from the countryside to the city, right? So these will bring their special characteristics of language, right? Language use, language contact, language change, and so on. Here, a branch of scholars follow the Lebovian paradigm to study variations related to immigration, right? And also to language use in the city, right? So for example, Xu Daming and his colleagues invented the method of asking the way to collect their data in the city to see what kind of varieties are used. On the other hand, there is also a more fluid view of sociolinguistics of globalization following Bloma's theory. So they are not focusing on the distribution of linguistic varieties in particular places. Rather, they will study mobility, right? For example, how people try to use different linguistic varieties to change their identities for higher mobility. Right? Language contact and language change. So here we have very quick, very fast economic growth, and people are moving from the countryside to the city, and also moving out of the country. And here we have language contact. As people meet, they have contact, the language also change, right? So there is the contact between 普通话, the standard variety of the Chinese language, with various dialects. There is also the contact between the Chinese language and minority languages, and there is also the contact between the Chinese language and foreign languages, particularly English. And as a result, there is language change. Now, there is a big controversy as a social event over the inclusion of a bunch of lettered words in the standard, very authoritarian modern Chinese dictionary. Right? So in 2012, this dictionary included, the new version of the dictionary included 239 letter words. That is English acronyms like NBA, BBS, and letter character blending like T Xu Shan, X Guang. T Xu Shan means T-shirt, right? Or X Guang means X-ray, right? So are they really Chinese, right? So some people are strongly against this idea, and they protested by saying that these letter words are polluting the purity of Chinese characters. On the other hand, more people, and more commonly, people are saying that the use of these letter words are already facts, are already reality in China, and it's only natural to include them in a dictionary, right? So there is a large debate, but actually, well, they are accepted gradually. Language attitudes, right? So here we have some big social events, such as the handover of Hong Kong and Macau, or the return of the sovereignty to the People's Republic of China, and also the existence of multilingualism and multidialectalism, right? And also, well, more recently, English is increasingly used as a medium of instruction and also in intercultural communication. So all these bring the necessity of studying language attitudes. So we have some studies on language attitudes in Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and Beijing. This is a study that I conducted with my colleagues once in 1997, right before the handover of Hong Kong, and we used the match the guys technique. And 20 years later, we replicated the study, right? In 2000, sorry, there's a mistake here, should be 2017. And also there is a study of language attitudes in Macau, right? There are also language attitudes regarding minority languages, Chinese dialects, and Chinese and foreign languages, and language variation. So they are different percentages according to Zhao's review of language attitude studies, right? More recently, there is an issue of using English as a medium of instruction, right? And also as using English, including English in the national entrance exam for college. And this generated a very big debate, right? And there were some studies here, right? There were also attitude studies regarding varieties of English, such as China English, Japan English, British English, American English, and also African American English, and so on, right? So those are being studied, right? And the general finding is that the Chinese college students still favored British English and American English, right? Language identities. So here we are looking at the subjective aspect of the language learner and language user, right? So a branch of language identity studies is related to linguistic vitality. That is, to what extent the ethnic minorities will maintain their own languages and their own ethnic identities while they also learn to use 普通话, right? Another kind of study is to study the identities of Chinese learners of foreign languages. So here I studied the successful or the so-called best foreign language learners in China and how they dealt with different languages and different identities related to these languages. And the result was productive bilingualism. That is, 1 + 1 is greater than 2. The two languages and the two identities will reinforce each other. And this is different from the conventional additive and subtractive bilingualism as proposed by Lambert. Right. More recently, I came up with 4 types of L2 identities or learner identities or L2 user identities. Faithful imitator of the native speaker, legitimate speaker of the language, of the second language, playful creator of the new language, and the dialogical communicator. The last one is related to productive bilingualism, and this is what we promote. Right? In pragmatics, right, there is an overlap between pragmatics and sociolinguistics. Chen Xinren from Nanjing University conducted a lot of studies on what he called pragmatic identity. Linguistic landscape is relatively a new area in sociolinguistics, right? And we see a lot of studies are discussion of theories and methods, right? And there are also studies that combine linguistic landscape and other areas, such as language planning and language identities. Contemporary Chinese discourse studies, right? Here we have a series of books of Nankai discourse studies, right? And there are many of them focused on critical discourse analysis. There are also other kinds of studies focused on different domains. Here I will introduce a little bit what we called discourse studies. Right? This is new in China. And in the Chinese tradition, death and dying are taboos, and we should not talk about it. Right? But this is very much changing as the society is changing. So here we followed Matheson to map out a cartography of discourse, death discourse, or different genres related to this. So here we have 3 circles. The inner circle is the general function. The outer circle is the subtype of these functions. And here, the 3rd circle are specific examples of these subtypes. So for example, here, the inner circle, we have only 8 general functions: describing, recreating, expressing, performing, directing, advising, arguing, and expounding. And the subtypes, for example, describing, we have reporting and narrating. And as examples of this discourse, for reporting, we have obituary, breaking bad news in the medical context, and for narrating, we have memoirs and so on. These are the definitions. And we have studied Chinese discourse types in these various aspects, and they are still ongoing. Right? For example, living will is a new genre in China. Before death, patients will say what kind of medical intervention they do not want. For example, resuscitation. Right? Pre-planning of funeral is a new genre. And again, family meeting in palliative care, where family members talk about the dying and the death, right? And how methods should be taken to face the next step, right? And this is very new in China. And we can see that there is a mutual relationship between the social structure on the one hand and the speech form on the other hand. So here we have the time, right? The time is changing. And here we have the social value. In the past, we have the group interest goes first. And we have power distance. We have longevity, which is very much valued. And now individual right over their life is being stressed, and quality is very much highlighted, right? Now here we have the speech form. In the past, there is the linguistic taboo about this, and now there is more open speech. So we have, on the one hand, speech form realizes the social context. On the other hand, it also constructs the social context, right? So that's the discourse practice has two functions. Okay, I think I've used up very much the time. I'll skip the institutionalization. I'll just say that there is the Association of Chinese Sociolinguistics, which holds conferences, and that's going on, international conferences. Maybe one day you can come. And there are some journals that are exclusively devoted to sociolinguistics. There are also journals that have columns for sociolinguistics, or they do carry articles in sociolinguistics. Now, the general characteristics. There is a strong descriptive and practice-focused orientation in sociolinguistics in China, as prominent research areas are bound to the local context and practical social concerns. There are also some new theoretical concepts in specific domains, for example, language preservation, functional planning, productive bilingualism, and so on. But these are to be examined in other contexts. There is continuous integration as well as tension between indigenous concerns and academic traditions on the one hand, and imported Western theories and methods on the other. Now in China, scholars of Chinese and ethnic minorities will focus probably more on indigenous concerns, while scholars of foreign languages probably will be more oriented to Western theories and methods. And sometimes there is a very clear divide, which is to be addressed in future. Right? International collaboration and exchange are still very much limited. Right? And I think we have great prospects in these areas, right, for international collaboration and exchange. For example, we might have common concerns such as globalization, rescue of endangered linguistic varieties, and language and social change. Particularly, Asian countries probably have similar concerns. We might do some cross-cultural comparisons in areas such as health communication discourse and death discourse. Right? We might construct new theories and methods based on international data. Right? These are to be further explored. Right? I very much thank all the audience, all the organizers, and I look forward to your response. Right? So here are some of the references. Thank you very much.
네, 잠시 양해 말씀드리겠습니다. 발표 시간으로 인해서 휴식 시간 없이 바로 다음 발표로 이어가겠습니다. So there's one quick notice. We'll just go straight to next presentation due to the time limit. All right, our next presentation is done by Dr. Lionel Wee from Singapore National University. He's currently a professor in the Department of English Language and Literature and also the Vice Dean of Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Today he'll be presenting on sociolinguistic research in Singapore and Malaysia.
Hello, I'm Lionel Wee from the National University of Singapore, and I'm here today to talk about sociolinguistic research in Singapore and Malaysia. In this presentation, I discuss 3 examples of the sociolinguistic research that has been conducted in relation to Singapore and Malaysia. I then draw attention to some of the themes that the research highlights. Finally, I close by describing what I see as some of the emerging and important questions that sociolinguistic research needs to be concerned with. Here are 3 examples of sociolinguistic research conducted in relation to Malaysia and Singapore, and the first is Albury 2017. Using Malaysia as a case study, Albury is a critical discussion of the current skepticism towards the products of critical linguistics, such as translanguaging and metrolingualism. Concepts like translanguaging and metrolingualism are aimed at criticizing the idea of language as a self-contained autonomous system. The goal is to emphasize that speakers' use of language mix the resources associated with conventionally established linguistic varieties like English or Malay to such an extent that any presumption of an existing autonomous linguistic system cannot be accepted as plausible. Albury's study is not a rejection of concepts like translanguaging or metrolingualism, but it cautions us that an acceptance of these concepts should not necessarily mean a rejection of more traditional views of language. There may be a need to find ways of allowing both new and traditional views of language to coexist. Thus, Albury argues that ideas inherent to languaging developed and refined in academia over the last decade are already firmly embedded in Malaysian linguistic culture to describe local linguistic behavior. Bahasa Rojak fills this role, the function of which was enthusiastically described by Malaysian youth as the fluid exploitation of multilingual resources specific to the context and ethnic identities of those present in the conversation, to foster meaning-making across ethno-linguistic divides. For these youth, Bahasa Rojak can have infinite manifestations because its genesis is the linguistic resources of speakers at any given time and location, rather than an essentialized view of any language with a focus on function rather than form. However, Manglish, also a phenomenon of language contact that falls under the umbrella term Bahasa Rojak, was indeed described in essentialized terms. The students often gave resolute definitions of Manglish with a focus on form rather than function, such that it was defined variously as a new language, as comprising a Malay or English substrate, or Mandarin and English in the view of Chinese students, and incorporating lexica from a donor language, or as specific linguistic patterns or rules. Although the students offered different ideas on what these patterns or rules are, they all nonetheless relied on an essentialized view of language to explain Manglish that they did not rely on for Bahasa Rojak. The Costa 2016 investigates the role that English language acquisition plays in the goal that many countries, including Singapore, have of trying to attract highly valued foreign students. In the case of Singapore, the recruitment scholarship process is overseen by the Singapore government's Ministry of Education, and applicants usually come from Asian countries such as China, Indonesia, and Vietnam. The scholarship recruitment team, comprising school principals, department heads, meets with local officials. A recruitment talk is publicized, and schools are invited to send their students to the talk. There is a selection test, which involves a psychometric test, a math and English diagnostic test, all designed by the Ministry of Education. Grading is done immediately by the Singapore team, and the test scores released. Applicants are shortlisted on the basis of their test scores and invited back the next day for interviews. Successful applicants arrive in Singapore for an intensive English language bridging course to help them transition to the mainstream school classes. Scholarship students feel much pressure to justify their presence, and language learning plays an important part in this process. The students studied by DaCosta often employed characteristics associated with entrepreneurship, such as resourcefulness, semiotic dexterity, and willingness to take risks in their English language learning, as a way of presenting themselves as subjects that align well with the personhood expected of scholars. For instance, a scholarship student from China named Jenny explained the difficulties she faced in learning English and how she tried, ultimately with great success given that she went on to top a class, to overcome them. Jenny described how in dealing with the problems of acquiring new vocabulary, memorization initially seemed to suffice. But she later realized that for a word to sink into her long-term memory, she needed to be able to apply it to the context of a sentence. She was often seen using her electronic dictionary in class, furiously keying in words unknown to her and waiting for an answer in Mandarin Chinese to be generated. In another study, Ben, Said, and Ong 2019 analyzed creative writing forms on signboards collected in Malaysia and Singapore. They showed that the signboards combine graphic elements with alphabetical script to form appealing names for shops, as well as creating playful puns and adopting new spellings. For example, in Figure 1, the image of a durian is used to form the letter D in a shop called Durian. And in Figure 2, EpiLife, the name of an electronics shop, makes use of various types of electronic gadgets such as MP3 players, wires, plugs, USB sticks, and adapters, all of which are creatively juxtaposed to spell out the shop name. Albury's paper makes a very important point. Certainly, traditional ideas about language ought to be challenged and, if possible, rendered defunct. But it is also important to be sensitive to the possibility that there could be opposition and resistance to new ideas about language, especially if traditional ideas are still vital because individuals and communities have stakes in them. That is, many individuals and communities do think about their languages in traditional and essentialist terms, and they will quite naturally be resistant to attempts at questioning or criticizing these ways of looking at language. I'm certainly not suggesting that there is no need to rethink or challenge essentialist stances, for example. But a more cautious view towards traditional notions is necessary because many of the notions that might otherwise be dismissed as outdated are still highly influential in many communities. We should not be too quick to simply dismiss still powerful and influential conservative positions as irrelevant. The key issue concerning new theoretical ideas is to be sensitive to the conditions that are keeping traditional and apparently outdated ideas very much alive. Getting individuals and communities to rethink their approaches to language means working with the relevant people and groups, understanding how deeply entrenched some language traditions might be, and getting the people and groups to accept, where necessary, that such entrenched traditions might need to change. DeCosta's paper highlights the importance of studying linguistic entrepreneurship. Linguistic entrepreneurship is an act of aligning with the moral imperative to strategically exploit language-related resources for enhancing one's worth in the world. And a linguistic entrepreneur is an actor who demonstrates such alignment. Understood in this way, linguistic entrepreneurship is one specific manifestation of the commodification of language. Linguistic entrepreneurship presents the learning of languages as a responsibility of a good citizen and ideal neoliberal worker. While linguistic entrepreneurship overlaps with and supplements the commodification of language, it also crucially is distinct from the former, as it offers a way of talking about how the neoliberal framing of language learning is deeply grounded in subjective experiences and the formation of subjects. One prominent example of linguistic entrepreneurship is the Korean early study abroad phenomenon known as Gao Yihong. A number of Korean middle-class parents have been known to send their children abroad to study in English-speaking countries such as the US, Canada, Australia, and sometimes Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines or Singapore. The goal is to acquire valuable competence in the English language to help the student get ahead in the competition for better educational and job opportunities upon returning to Korea. But relevant to the idea of linguistic entrepreneurship is the fact that Gao Yihong is not purely about acquiring linguistic competence in English. The student's immersion into an English-speaking environment is meant to help her to become a native speaker of English, something that is otherwise considered impossible back in Korea, thus helping the student to fully realize the value of her human capital on the global stage. This is why Gao Yihong is considered an effective strategy for competition in Korean society. Its entrepreneurial motivations, in which acquisition of English is pursued as part of a project to enhance the value of human capital in the body of the student, position the student as a good neoliberal subject. The paper by Ben Said and Ong is part of an important shift in linguistic landscape studies away from more quantitative approaches towards more qualitative ones. Many linguistic landscape studies have been concerned with distributional issues, that is, the relative distributions of particular languages in selected sites. This is a quantitative distributive approach, where the focus tends to be on counting and comparing how many instances of different languages can be found in a given landscape. However, as Blomert points out, such an approach has its limitations. As he says, quantitative linguistic landscape study, as the very first step, will draw attention to the existence and presence of language in a particular space and can answer questions such as how many languages are used in space X. But the argument does not cut very deep, and what we get is a rather superficial, horizontal, and distributional image of multilingualism. The fact that these languages are ingredients of multimodal science and that these signs occur in non-random ways in public space is left aside. When a qualitative approach is adopted, the landscape is seen as a constellation of interpretable signs. There are many other works that also adopt more qualitative analyses. These studies are very much focused on looking at the ways in which ideologies pervade the landscape, such as Stroud and Pendukana's study of the politics of aspiration in South Africa, Pennycook's analysis of the production of graffiti in urban areas or graph-scapes, and Lehman and Moden's discussion of the commodification of language in Washington, D.C.'s Chinatown, to mention just a few. The studies by Albury and DeCosta focus on the role of ideologies, but what they show is that it is not just ideologies of language that are relevant. In both studies, ideologies about Bahasa Rojak, Manglish, and English language learning show that language is inextricably connected to other parts of social life, including how personhood is constructed. So it is important to pay attention to how ideologies influence the ways we think about language, as well as about how the speakers and communities who use particular languages are indexed. The study by Van Salim and Ong give attention to how the language found in the linguistic landscape, in this case, commercial signboards, can be considered creative. For these authors, one way in which creativity is manifested is when objects are stylized to represent letters. But in addition to the focus on ideologies and creativity, there are emerging questions that any study of language in society will need to be cognizant of, questions that cannot be easily ignored. One question relating to the issue of ideology and personhood is this: how should we think about the use of computers and artificial intelligence in language? Another question relating to creativity in the linguistic landscape is this: what are the communicative purposes of language use in the landscape? Answering the first question requires giving attention to automation. Answering the second question requires giving attention to affect. Let me first discuss the issue of automation. Consider automation. Take as one example the by now very common use of automated signs at car parks to indicate to drivers if a car park is full, and if not, just how many empty lots are actually available. Thus, a driver who is approaching a car park may variously encounter a sign that says car park full, or one that says, for instance, 86 lots available. The automated sign at the entrance to the car park is obviously intended to be communicative, having been programmed to take note of the number of cars that are already present in the car park and to convey in real time the relevant information, that is, how many lots are still empty, to drivers who may be thinking of parking their cars there. In a multi-story car park, drivers may even be told of how many empty lots are available at different levels. For example, level 3, 24 level lots, or level 4, 35 lots. This raises the question of how we are supposed to conceptualize the communicative act. Certainly, we want to acknowledge that whoever programmed and installed the machine intended for it to be useful, and that its usefulness includes conveying the relevant information. But already here, there are at least two problems. First, we cannot blithely assume that the programmer is a human being, since there may be cases where some form of communicative technology has been created by a computer program. This latter scenario is not as far-fetched as it seems because machines are already capable of writing their own code. Second, regardless of whether the communicative technology was created by another human being or by a computer program, the specific information that is being conveyed at any one time about the state of the car park, for example, the actual number of lots available or whether the car park is full, is not something that the programmer would likely even be aware of. The information is gathered and conveyed via program sensors that are independent of the programmer, which is of course the whole point of the programming. As programs get more sophisticated and autonomous, think of Google Assist or Apple's Siri, it becomes more difficult and less plausible to equate the messages communicated by the program with those of its programmer. Another example involves the concept of an echoborg. An echoborg is a person whose utterances and gestures are determined to varying degrees by the communications that originate from an artificial intelligence program. Lamb 2015 provides a succinct description of what might happen with echoborgs. AIs use human surrogates or echoborgs to speak their words and socialize with humans. The living, breathing avatar simply recites the computer's words at the conference table, serving as a humanizing conduit for an inhuman will. The interactional goal is to give the illusion that one is communicating with a fellow human being when in fact the communication originates from an artificial intelligence. the human with whom one is apparently communicating is really working at the behest of the artificial intelligence. Echo box can be useful since some individuals might feel more comfortable if they think they are interacting with another human, even though the kinds of information and advice they want is better and more efficiently provided by an artificial intelligence. This syncing of a human front with messages that are created by an artificial intelligence raises conceptual issues such as the nature of speakerhood. Who exactly is speaking under such a condition, where the activity of speaking is distributed over more than one entity? Is it the human extension, or is it the artificial intelligence, or is such a binary approach misguided? Cases where the human element is increasingly distant from the use of language for communicative purposes will get harder to ignore, and they pose conceptual challenges for the study of language in society. Let us now consider the issue of affect. Whereas emotions refer to the culturally given labels that we assign to experiences of individuals or groups, affect is much more general and instead refers to any evaluative, positive or negative orientation toward an object. Emotions are typically assumed to reside within the entity that is feeling the emotion. This entity is often taken to be the individual, and in some cases the group, where the latter is then conceptualized as a single entity because the individual members all seem to be sharing the same emotion or to be in the same emotional state. This way of thinking about emotions as being internal to the feeling entity, be it the group or the individual, shifts the focus away from the role that the surrounding environment and the objects that help constitute the environment play in shaping or affecting the emotions of the entity in question. This shift of focus away from the environment is avoided if we think in terms of affect rather than emotions. This is because affect involves an orientation towards an object, and this serves in turn to emphasize that affect is fundamentally relational in nature. Thinking in terms of affect also allows us to focus on a variety of phenomena that are not always clearly identifiable via specific emotion labels. For example, there are states or capacities that are not obviously emotions, even though they do have emotional dimensions, such as being alert or being patient. Emotions are typically thought of as relatively short-lived and spontaneous. They are not usually thought of as cultivatable, even though they can be. In such cases, emotions also blur into other states or capacities that are not usually thought of as emotions, such as he is a highly resilient person, or John is one of our most vigilant security guards. Thinking in terms of affect then has the advantage of allowing us to capture the range from prototypical emotions to states and capacities, because the focus is on the orientation towards objects in the environment, and such an orientation can encompass a myriad of reactions and responses. From a landscape perspective, this is useful because it allows us to confront more sociologically oriented questions, like the extent to which certain ideologies might be materially emplaced as part of the semiotic landscape. In other words, the landscape should not merely be seen as the context in which individuals or groups experience or express emotions, but importantly, as contributing to these very experiences qua affect. For example, Wee 2016 shows how the Arlington National Cemetery represents a site where a specific kind of affective regime is cultivated, namely one where honor and respect are to be accorded to the servicemen who died for the country. There are signs on the cemetery grounds that request silence and respect, as well as visitors' rules that explain that because the cemetery is a shrine to the honored dead, disorderly conduct, boisterous language, among others, are prohibited. Wee defines an affective regime in the following manner. It is the set of conditions that govern, with varying degrees of hegemonic status, the ways in which particular kinds of affect can be appropriately materialized in the context of a given site. Because an affective regime operates at the level of the site, even in the absence of any particular individual, that is, even when a given site happens to be uninhabited or unoccupied, it is still meaningful to speak of an affective regime associated with that environment. This is because the site itself can be structured in ways intended to evoke particular dispositions, regardless of whether anyone happens to be present. Some affective regimes may be explicitly concerned with encouraging particular affects, as in the signs at the Arlington Cemetery. Other affective regimes may be less directly concerned with specific affects, but they nonetheless have the effect, intended or otherwise, of encouraging some affects while discouraging others, such as the use of CCTVs, which typically alerts individuals that they are in an area under surveillance, but leaves unspecified, and hence up to the individuals to infer for themselves just what kinds of behaviors are to be considered appropriate or inappropriate to that specific site. Consider the following examples, all taken from various locations within the same public library in Singapore. Number 1, feeling tired? Please refrain from sleeping in the library. Let's make this library delightful for all. Number 2, be considerate. Everyone wants a quiet place to read. Number 3, be considerate. Share the library materials and facilities. Sleep at home, not in the library. In these examples, the library's goal is to encourage a sense of consideration among its visitors. With this in mind, we can return to the Ben, Said, and Ong examples shown earlier in figures 1 and 2. Arguably, the creative use of the image of a durian or drawings of electronic gadgets to spell out words is intended to convey that the retailers involved, the durian seller or the electronics shop, are fun, witty, and humorous individuals. Concomitantly, the hope is that this will have the effect of making the retailers more attractive to prospective customers. In this presentation, I've highlighted a number of research themes, ideologies about language and its various speakers, about creativity in the linguistic landscape, about automation, and about affect. Needless to say, while the examples discussed have come primarily from the Singapore and Malaysian context, these are themes with very broad scope, and research into these themes is relevant to just about any society.
Okay, let me introduce the next presenter. Dr. Shirley Dita is a professor in the Department of English Language and Applied Linguistics from De La Salle University of the Philippines. She is a former chair of the Linguistic Society of Philippines and now an international director of the Sociolinguistic Society of Korea. Professor Dita today is giving a presentation on sociolinguistics in the Philippines, seatbed, spectrum, and standpoints.
Good day, everyone. I am honored to be part of the 2020 International Conference of the Sociolinguistics Society of Korea. And I'd like to thank Dr. Pike for inviting me to be a part of this very prestigious gathering. I'm Shirley Dita from De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines. And today, I'm going to talk about the sociolinguistics studies in the Philippines. This will be the outline of my lecture. First, I'll start with the seedbeds by giving an overview of the Philippines, and then go on with the shapers and influencers, The next one would be about the spectrums or the scope of sociolinguistics in the country. And I'll be discussing again the shapers, the development, the role of linguists and the organizations, and then go on with the standpoints where I'll talk about the directions, especially in the post-pandemic era. Just to give you a background, I'm showing you now the map of the Philippines. As you can see, it is very colorful. This represents the different languages in the country. To date, the population of the Philippines has already reached approximately 110 million. As you can see in the map, there are many Philippine languages in the country, and that explains why we are highly multilingual, and therefore we are highly multicultural as well. There are three main islands in the Philippines. This comprises the Luzon Island, this is the Visayas Island, and this is the Mindanao Island. But all in all, we have to date 7,641 islands. We used to have only 7,107. So apparently, there are islands that have been discovered recently. The official languages of the country are Filipino and English, and we consider English as a second language, being the former colony of America. And we use English as an official language too. Philippines is reputed to be the English Mecca in Asia. One very interesting question when you mention Philippines would always be the number of languages in the country. So I'm presenting to you the different figures over the years about the exact number of Philippine languages. Starting off with Reed in 1971 when he said that there are more than 80 Philippine languages. It was followed by McFarland in 1980, and he claimed there are 118 Philippine languages. Followed by the same author in 1984, and he said 110 Philippine languages. Constantino, on the other hand, claimed there are 100, maybe about 110 in 1988. And then Reed claims around 150 in 2000. Remember, he was the one who said more than 80 in 1971. And the Ethnologue in 2002 claims that there are 163 Philippine languages. However, Headland in 2003 said between 100 to 150. And then Ethnologue in 2005 reports 168 Philippine languages. In 2018, Ethnologue claims there are 187 Philippine languages, 183 of which are living. In the most recent report of Ethnologue, that is 2020, there are 186 Philippine languages. That's -1 from the 2018 Ethnologue report. The reason is that Aita Tayabas has been removed in the list. So to talk more about the languages, we have 186 established languages. 2 of them are already extinct and 184 are living. Of the 186, 175 are considered to be indigenous, while none are non-indigenous. As for the status of the languages, 37 are considered institutional, 68 are developing, 38 vigorous, 30 are in trouble, 11 are dying, and 3 are unestablished. As for the number of speakers of the top Philippine languages, according to the NSO in 2000, Tagalog is the most dominant language in the country with approximately 22 million speakers. And that's followed by Cebuano with 18.5 million speakers, and then Ilocano with 7.7 million, and then Hiligaynon with 6.9 million, Bicolano with 4.5 million speakers, Waray with 3.1 million, Kapampangan with 2.3 million, Pangasinan with 1.5 million, and Kinaraya with 1.1 million speakers. Tausug, Maguindanao, and Maranao have 1 million speakers each. The usual confusion lies in the three interchangeable terms, and that is Tagalog, Filipino, and Filipino. So Tagalog is the most dominant language in the country, as I have just mentioned. And then Filipino refers to the speaker or to the people, but it also refers to the language. Okay, Filipino is currently the national language of the country, and it also refers to the person or to the speaker of the language. Sociolinguistics in the Philippines came actually initially as peripheral concern in the country. The number one concern of linguistic studies would be about language teaching and language learning. Also, the sociolinguistics in the country is largely dependent on the policies surrounding language issues, which I'm going to discuss next. And partially, the sociolinguistics in the country is also based on the expertise of linguists working on different sub-areas. I'm going to talk now about the shapers of sociolinguistic studies in the Philippines. And this is highly influenced by, first, the political situation, either in education or in language, and also the issues and policies. The shapers of sociolinguistics are also found in the academe or the universities offering linguistics, and also the scholars specializing in linguistics. Sociolinguistics is also influenced by the organizations, as they are the ones organizing the conferences, and the journals and publications are also produced by these organizations. In the early period of sociolinguistics studies, the majority of them were actually because of national language. As you can see here, the establishment of national language is the number one concern of the sociolinguistic studies in the country. We started with Tagalog as the national language in 1920s, although this is highly resisted by the majority of the Filipinos because back then, Tagalog was not the dominant language. It was Cebuano. But Tagalog is the language of the capital region or Metro Manila. And then in 1959, the national language became Filipino. And that is to capture all the Philippine languages in the country. Because Tagalog only refers to a few, but Filipino would subsume all Philippine languages. But in 1973, the Filipino national language was changed into F or Filipino. And again, they should represent the other Philippine languages and not just Tagalog. Although if you look at it, Filipino is about 95% Tagalog. So if you ask my opinion, is Filipino an actual language? I would say Filipino is the political term for Tagalog. Tagalog is the actual language or the dominant language of the country. But in Filipino, as the national language, the other Philippine languages, okay, are already subsumed here. So there are certain terms in other Philippine languages that have already been lexicalized in the Filipino language. So this is the current national language of the Philippines. Another source of sociolinguistic studies in the country would be the language policies that have been happening in the country. If you recall, I mentioned in the beginning that Philippines is a former colony of America. And hence, in the early 19th hundred, the medium of instruction has been just English. So we were under the EOP, or the English only policy, for many, many years. It was not until 1974 where we had the BEP, or the bilingual education policy. So that is English and Tagalog, or Filipino. And again, for many, many years, we had the BEP, or the bilingual education policy, although the majority of the schools and universities still make use of English as the dominant MOI. In 2012, there was a complete paradigm shift because the medium of instruction, but this only applies to kindergarten and grades 1, 2, and 3 of elementary, is now mother tongue based multilingual education, or the use of the dominant language of a certain locality as the medium of instruction in the kindergarten up to grade 3, or the initial stages of schooling. And because of that, a lot of sociolinguistic studies have revolved around the language policies and MOIs in the country. Tracing the roots of sociolinguistics studies in the country, Andrew Gonzalez claimed in 1985 that as early as 1870, there are already bits of sociolinguistics studies, and that is the work of De La Cavada, which is all about history, geography, geology, and statistics in the Philippines. And this kind of a study required surveys, and hence it could be subsumed under sociolinguistics. Also, during the 19th century, early 19th century, there were a lot of surveys of different indigenous tribes. There were also censuses that happened during this time, one in 1903, 1918, 1939, 1948, 1960, 1970, and 1980. But the real start of the sociolinguistic studies in the Philippines would be in the 1920s, according to Gonzalez in 1985. He argues that the start of sociolinguistics studies in the Philippines was during this period. Okay? And the focus of his studies during this period was on language planning and development. And among the pioneering figures during this time were Otto Schirer, Cecilio Lopez, and Lope K. Santos. The works of these three figures were the most important during that time. Otto Schirer published in 1920 The Problem of a National Language for the Philippine Islands in the Light of the History of the Language in Parallel Columns. However, it was published in Spanish, the title of which is El Problema de un Idioma Nacional para Filipinas ante la Historia de las Lenguas. Another important work that came out during that period was that of Cecilio Lopez in 1941, which is the Manual of Philippine National Language. It was written in English. The Filipino version of this one came out in 1940, and it was produced by Lope K. Santos, and it was entitled Balarila ng Wikang Pambansa. It's actually Manual of the Philippine National Language too, but in Filipino. So these three works were considered very significant during this period. In the 1930s, what was considered to be the most important work was that of Romualdez, or it was called the Romualdez Law of 1936. Gonzalez claims that this is the most complete and sophisticated piece of legislation on language planning that has ever been drafted anywhere in the world, and not just in the Philippines. The Romualdez Law contains details and instructions on how to go about forming the national language. Also during this period was the founding of the Institute of National Language, and they have sponsored a lot of research and lectures on language cultivation. In 1960s, the trend then was language policy formulation. And one important work during that time was that of Sibayan et al. 1967, which is actually a survey on the implementation of vernacular education. The survey was actually 10 years in the making from 1957 to 1967. However, there was only limited sample. So the survey investigated the use of major vernaculars as medium of instruction in grades 1 and 2 as a form of transitional bilingual education. And this was in recognition of the 1951 UNESCO recommendation on the use of mother tongues in the initial stage of learning. Ward in 1971 came up with a review of the Philippine linguistics studies, and the coverage was from 1525 to 1969. He reviewed 3,600 works, or 191 bibliographic works, or 183 journals and periodicals. All in all, he reviewed 7,608 entries. And with these 7,608 entries, Ward claims that 488 of them dealt with sociology and language, or with sociolinguistics, or with touches of sociolinguistics. In the 1970s, the trend of sociolinguistics studies was on survey. It's all survey. And one of the most important survey was done by the Language Studies Center, which was founded by the Philippine Normal College. And this is now PNC back then. And now it's called the Philippine Normal University. Gonzalez in 1985 claims that the survey done by Language Studies Center was the first systematic nationwide survey, which of course made of careful sampling. There was also excellent training in interviewing, and in the survey included were the parents, the teachers, and major people on language use in and out of school. Otanes and Sibayan 1969 reports about this survey. Also trending during the 1970s would be largely on language surveys. There were surveys on Filipino as medium of instruction. There were surveys on the implementation of the bilingual education policy, surveys on code switching, surveys on language use and language attitudes, and the use of code switching variety. As a matter of fact, Gonzalez in 1985 says that in language surveys, the Philippines is perhaps one of the best surveyed countries in the world, certainly in Southeast Asia. Also, Philippines is one of the most sophisticated in terms of instrument construction and networking and competence in the planning and management of language surveys. In 1984, Sibayan claims that the early 80s or the whole of 80s was the period of BCS in sociolinguistics studies. Okay. Among the very important outputs during this period were dissertations that were produced by the PNC, Ateneo, and De La Salle Consortium. And here are the best dissertations produced during this period. Leading the list would be that of Maria Lourdes S. Bautista in 1980, which is all about code switching in Tagalog and English. Another one is that of Chan Yap in 1974 about Hokkien Chinese borrowings in Tagalog. Castillo in 1978 about the communicative competence in Filipino. Regio de Dios in 1976 about Philippine Creole Spanish. Santiago in 1979 on the technical lexicon of Filipino, and Fabregas in 1981 about language use, needs, attitudes of people of certain occupations. In 1980s, the trend of sociolinguistic studies was the use of English. Okay. Everyone was surveying on the use of English, and most of them were actually produced by Maria Lourdes S. Bautista. Among the topics done during this period would be the type of English as used by different walks of life. This one coming by was done by Bautista. The Yaya English or the nursemaid English. There was also the English of the bar hostess or the English of colegiala or college girls. There were also a lot of studies on code switching, and most of them also coming from Bautista. So code switching as used in offices and business establishments, and the motivations on the use of code switching. Also trending during this period that can also be considered as sociolinguistics in nature would be dialect mapping. And this was used by Pittman in the 1950s. Okay, so a lot of studies did dialect mapping. Also, behavioral tests of mutual intelligibility. A lot of them made use of this one. And McFarland in 1981 produced the Atlas of Philippine Languages, which involved, of course, dialect mapping and language surveys and behavioral tests of mutual intelligibility. Some of the notable Philippine sociolinguistics during this early period were this one. Let me go back to that one, okay? Brother Andrew Gonzalez tops the list, okay? Followed by Bonifacio P. Sibayan and Teodoro Liamzon, Maria Lourdes S. Bautista. These are actually considered the luminaries of linguistics in the country, the most important figures of linguistics in the country. And the majority of them actually worked on sociolinguistics. It started with sociolinguistics, but some of them also did theoretical linguistics, okay, and some of them in other fields or subfields of linguistics. We also have Emmy Pascasio, Emma Castillo, Feotanes, and Emma Bernabe. Only a few of them are still living. The majority of them have already passed away. As for the present day sociolinguistics, Filipino in open and closed parentheses, because there are Filipino, but they are all over the world. And topping the list is Tapsi Ruani Tupas, but he is now UK based, although he did his undergrad in the Philippines and stayed in the Philippines for a bit. Most of his academic career, were spent in Singapore, and currently he now moved to the UK. His most important work would be Unequal Englishes, The Politics of Englishes Today, which was produced in 2015. And there were a lot of topics in this, a lot of publications in this topic. One was published in the Journal of Social Linguistics in 2016. It's all about unequal Englishes in the Philippines. He was also working on inequalities of multilingualism and the politics of Philippine English. Beatriz Lorente is another important figure. However, she's also outside the country and based in Switzerland. Her work revolved around migration and domestic workers, and also politics of English. Other present-day Filipino sociolinguistics would include Francis Dumanig. He started in the Philippines, then moved to Malaysia, and now he's based in Hawaii. Most of his works were on linguistic landscape, some in language policy and management, and a bit of critical discourse analysis. Another important Filipino sociolinguist is Angela Reyes. However, she would only visit Philippines, and she lived her entire life at New York. But her work still some Philippine sociolinguistics. She worked on linguistic anthropology, language and identity, discourse analysis, and she was very interested with Konyo as a variety in Philippine English. Other present-day Filipino sociolinguists include Isabel Martin from Ateneo de Manila University, and she works on multilingual education and MTBMLE, and also the politics of English and Philippine English. Jesus Federico Hernandez of UP Diliman works on language revitalization, and he is also supervising a lot of students working on this area. Another one is Alejandro Bernardo, who is the current president of LSP and works on acceptability of Philippine English. Paulo Valdez from DLSU works on language and power and linguistic landscape as well. Two very young and very promising sociolinguists are Aryan Borlongan, who is Japan-based in TUFS. He works on migration linguistics, which he claims to be a new field in this area. And he also works on the development of Philippine English. Another one very promising is Wilkinson Gonzalez, who is finishing his PhD in University of Michigan. He is now US-based. And he works on contact linguistics, particularly on Hokkien, Tagalog, and English. He also works on Philippine English. So these are the present-day social linguists. As you can see, social linguistics is very much alive in the Philippines, although the majority of the Filipinos working on this area are outside the country at the moment. I now turn to the organization as very important shapers of social linguistic studies in the country. And unlike Korea, where you have a lot of academic organizations, and there are actually per area, like there's organization on social linguistics, there's organization on corpus, organization on discourse analysis, and so forth and so on. In the Philippines, however, the Linguistic Society of the Philippines is the only organization that includes all the other subfields under linguistics. We don't have other organizations on linguistics. So all areas are subsumed under this organization called the Linguistic Society of the Philippines. There are other organizations, but they are geared towards language teaching, which is the PALT, or the Philippine Association of Language Teachers. There's also Reading Association. But when it comes to linguistics, okay, all subfields of linguistics are covered by the Linguistic Society of the Philippines. So this was organized in the school year 1969 to 1970. So it's 1969 actually, and this was the brainchild of Bonifacio Sibayan, Constantino, and Ernesto Constantino. They are both from Pacific and Asian Languages Institute in the University of Hawaii in 1968. And so when they came back to the Philippines, they formed the LSP. The official publication of LSP is PJL, or the Philippine Journal of Linguistics, which came out in June 1970. It's also worth mentioning that Brother Andrew Gonzalez, FSC, was the executive secretary for 17 years and the editor-in-chief of the Philippine Journal of Linguistics for 21 years. I've been mentioning Andrew Gonzalez since the start of my lecture. He is also the former president of my university, De La Salle University, and he also became the secretary of the Department of Education, or DepEd. To continue, LSP has been an important shaper of the sociolinguistics in the country. And that is because, okay, LSP is contributed to the forming of the consortium called the Ateneo PNC Consortium in the PhD in Linguistics. Later on, the consortium was joined in by De La Salle University. So it was later on called the Ateneo DLSU PNC Consortium on PhD in Bilingual Education. And one important product of this consortium is Maria Lourdes S. Bautista, okay, who did a lot of sociolinguistics studies in the country. Also, during this period, was the basis in sociolinguistics studies, as claimed by Sibayan. The Philippine Journal of Linguistics is also another shaper of sociolinguistics, because this is the only venue for publication back then in the country. Okay, this is the original version of PJL, but the current shape of PJL is now this one. Okay. I reported this one in my 2020 BPS lecture, Brother Andrew Gonzalez Distinguished Professorial Lecture. I presented the PJL trend, okay, from 1970 to 1980 versus the 2000 to 2010. As you can see here, in the early years, 70 to 80, the trend was theoretical linguistics, okay? The 78 publications were on theoretical linguistics, and applied would just be 22. Of this 22 applied, the majority of them are actually social linguistics studies. However, as you can see in 2000 to 2010, okay, the figures have already changed, and only a few are now dedicated to theoretical linguistics, actually just 30 of the ones that I reviewed, and the majority of them are now in the applied linguistics field, okay? And again, the majority of these applied linguistics studies are actually social linguistics. I'm showing you now the PGL trend from 2006 to 2019. It's a 15-year review of the trends in PGL. The orange ones are the applied linguistics, and the blue ones are the theoretical linguistics. And as you can see here, towards the latter part, okay, there are more orange than blue, okay? And as I mentioned a while ago, The orange one is all about applied linguistics, and social linguistics is considered applied linguistics. The theoretical linguistics will be, the theoretical linguistics is all about documentation of Philippine languages. I came up with an edited book which was released in 2011. It's called Issues and Trends in Applied Linguistics in the Philippines. However, this book only compiles works produced at De La Salle University. So it's a review of the issues and trends in applied linguistics in the Philippines, but just focusing on De La Salle University outputs. The scope was from 2000 to 2010. Section 2 of this book is devoted to social linguistics. And section 2 had 4 chapters. Okay. The topics were on language and gender, discourse analysis, conversational analysis, and language and power. There's also a journal by the UP Department of Linguistics, okay, and they have produced a lot of works as well. But what I'm showing you now would be the selected writings of Cecilio Lopez, where a lot of social linguistics studies have been done, okay. Currently, they relaunched the archive. Okay, it was relaunched only in 2018, and the most recent was just published in 2020. So UP Linguistics Journal, called the Archive Now, have also been instrumental in producing social linguistic studies in the country. Borlongan in 2018 posits, it is often said that the Philippines is a good laboratory for the study of social linguistics. Indeed, linguists from the Philippines have produced outstanding work on language planning, multilingualism, bilingual education, language attitudes, code switching, and world Englishes in the last century. And going back to the forecast of Brother Andrew Gonzalez in 1985, he mentioned that the role of English in Philippine life will be the focus, okay, of social linguistics studies in the coming years. He also claimed that the propagation of Philippine English, its eventual standardization and acceptance as a legitimate world variety will be the focus of social linguistics studies in the country. And true enough, today, the studies of Philippine English are thriving. That's what I do, and some of my PhD mentees and a lot of my colleagues. As for the directions, Brother Andrew Gonzalez had a lot of publication on this one, and he has always been pushing for the intellectualization of Filipino. However, up to this moment, okay, we cannot claim that Filipino is fully intellectualized. So I would say that the intellectualization of Filipino is still on the works. There's one dissertation in the University of Sydney done by Ramos, where he reviewed actually the works that are written in Filipino, and he claims that there are very few sources that are actually written in pure Filipino. For example, books in math and sciences, they are still largely in English, and only a few of them are written in Filipino. And hence, we cannot claim that Filipino is fully intellectualized. However, up to this day, okay, linguists and scholars are pushing for the intellectualization of Filipino. The intellectualization of other Philippine languages is also a concern, okay? But of course, we need to focus first on the intellectualization of Filipino. The attitudes towards the Philippine English as a legitimate variety is also a direction of sociolinguistics studies. There are a lot of surveys happening right now about the attitudes towards Philippine English as a legitimate variety. There are also a lot of surveys on the attitudes and perceptions of stakeholders on the implementation of MTB MLE, on its efficacy, on the struggles of teachers, and a lot about MTB MLE, about the implementation of MTB MLE. Language planning and language policies are still in the works. Okay. There are also investigations on the possibility of MTB MLE in higher levels and not just in K to 3 as what it is happening now. The revitalization of Philippine languages is very strong at the moment. There are a lot of PhD students working on this area. Many of them in the University of the Philippines, some of them in De La Salle University. Many of our PhD students are working on this one. There are a few in Philippine Normal University. Intelligibility of Englishes is also an important trend, okay, in sociolinguistics. I do some of the intelligibility of Philippine English as well. As for some standpoints, Brother Andrew said this one, to deal with the staggering decline in language diversity in the country, it is imperative for linguists in the Philippines to reframe language documentation and revitalization within a wider social justice framework that recognizes the interconnected nature of social categories, addresses the layered patterns of oppression, acknowledges intersectionality, and untangles the various factors that lead to sociolinguistic fragility and language demise. So language documentation and revitalization will still be the focus of sociolinguistic studies in the next years to come. As for the spectrums of sociolinguistics in the Philippines, so this figure sums it up. For the pre-COVID, we've been doing a lot of documentation of Philippine languages, a lot of studies on world Englishes, on multilingualism and MTB MLE, critical discourse analysis, especially political discourses, language and gender, linguistic landscapes, and forensic linguistics. As for the peri-COVID era, okay, studies are on online distance learning or ODL, still on discourse analysis, especially political discourses. A lot of corpus-based studies, computer-mediated communication, still on multilingualism, translingualism, world Englishes, language attitudes and perceptions, and again, world Englishes. But for post-COVID, okay, we forecast that studies will be based on corpus-based, or corpus linguistics will be the focus of most studies. Computer-mediated communication will still be there, world Englishes. Digital literacy will be the next focus. Discourse analysis, especially in virtual classrooms, forensic linguistics, and the social changes and language use. This one is also the recommendation or the forecast of Andrew Bernardo. For post-pandemic situations, there will be more surveys to determine the direction of research of language teaching, of attitudes, perception. At the moment, we are doing this now. There are a lot of surveys on what to do, how to conduct classes, what are the attitudes of learners, stakeholders about ODL, about virtual classroom, and so forth and so on. Corpus-based studies will flourish even more in post-pandemic situations. It is now happening, okay, because face-to-face investigations is not permitted at the moment, and hence the studies are usually corpus-based. Internet linguistics will be the direction in the next years to come. Intelligibility of Englishes will still be studied, especially that we now live in a borderless world. Okay, our students can actually listen to teachers from all over the world, and so intelligibility of Englishes would be a very important topic. The language of the COVID generation. Will there be a change in the language of the COVID generation? The current students now are considered the COVID generation. Online distance learning will still be investigated in the post-pandemic era. Virtual classrooms will still be the focus, and critical discourse analysis, because our communication is not the same, discourse is not the same, and hence more studies will be done on this one. So that will be the direction of sociolinguistics in the Philippines and possibly in other parts of the world as well. So that will be all, and just the selected reference of what I presented today. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Dita. We'll take a break. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you.